All right, here people come. Always exciting. Thanks everybody for joining this month's episode of Perspectives. We're just going to give another quick minute or so for attendees to file in. And while we're waiting, if you head to the chat, I would love to know where are you dialing in from. But also today, on this day, June 12th in 1981, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, that was released in the theater. So my question to you in the chat, what is your favorite blockbuster movie? It's kind of a summer blockbuster here in the Western hemisphere. So I would love to hear where are you dialing in from? And what is your favorite blockbuster, big budget extravaganza movie? Indiana Jones, says Ty. I love it. Ooh, The Godfather. There you go. See, panelists, this is why we show up early. We like to see the answers. Top Gun Maverick from Knoxville. Planet of the Apes. There we go. Here we go. People who dial in and didn't see the question are like, what is happening? I love it. Yeah. What's your favorite summer blockbuster and where are you calling in from? We got Kentucky, Denver, love it, Tampa. Good stuff. And if you're just dialing in, we're going to give one more minute for people to join. Everybody's running back to back with meetings. We're saying where we're calling in from and what's your favorite blockbuster movie? I'm seeing some Independence Day. Wouldn't it be funny if Independence, Missouri and Independence Day was your favorite movie? That'd be pretty cool. La La Land. All right, there you go. A lot of Top Gun. Dig it. One more minute, I promise. Just can't. I'm just obsessed with our audience's responses to these icebreaker questions. Starman. I'm not familiar with Starman. I have to think about that one. Deep Blue Sea. My summer movie watching list has just gotten extremely long all of a sudden. All right. I show us at 2:02, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for New Tools of the Management Trade. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. My name, of course, Matt Pepsel, the Godfather of Talent Optimization. I'll be your host today, and I'd like to get us started with Beth Gibson. Beth is the VP of People Strategy and Culture at Dealer Tire, and for the past 17 years, she's had the pleasure of partnering with her team members at Dealer Tire family of companies. There are 6 companies under the Dealer Tire umbrella, all focused on the automotive industry. With over 6,000 employees, it's vital that they live and breathe their values of innovation, playing to win, fairness, and personal and team accountability. Beth, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And next up, we'll have Rick. Rick Fernbaugh is the Director of Organizational Development at West Shore Home. West Shore Home is a residential bathroom, window, and door remodeling company with 40 locations in 20 states. Wow. He served 4 years in the U.S. Marine Corps and left as a sergeant. He has a master's degree in executive leadership from Liberty University and is a doctoral candidate in strategic leadership. Thanks so much for joining us today, Rick.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here.
And last but certainly not least, we have Kat Gehrig. She is the Vice President of Human Resources at Telamon Corporation. Telamon is a leading provider of connectivity, integration, implementation, and distribution solutions for many of the world's most recognized telecommunications, transportation, and consumer brands. Kat has spent over 20 years driving business performance through the heartbeat of companies, the people. She's passionate about building a culture and a company where people are connected and want to come and stay. Kat, thanks so much for joining the show today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
I'm excited, panelists, to get into our topic, and we're going to begin with a little bit of housekeeping, as we always do. I will share with you that the webinar is being recorded, and if you're a attendee today, it will be emailed to you in case you want to play that back and watch again any of our fantastic responses. There are going to be a Q&A session at the end. The audience Q&A is one of my favorite parts of the show, and if you have a question for our panelists or for myself, you're going to want to use the Q&A button, which is inside the Zoom window itself. If you put your question in chat, we might see it. If you put it in Q&A, we will see it. And you're going to want to stick around to the end because I'm going to share with you bonus resources as well as how to get in touch with our panelists. Now, as always, we always like to start with a little bit of a Menti poll. So what you're going to see on the next slide is a way that you can dig into the poll question here. If you've got a magic phone, you can take that QR code. It'll get you right to it. Or there's a link that Rachel has dropped into the chat, which will take you directly to our Menti poll. And this is all about 2 questions. The first of which of the following prevent managers from acting like leaders? And as these real-time results come in, panelists, I'll be asking you to kind of weigh in and see if there's any surprises for us here. So we have a lack of training or experience. We have lack of time, lack of self-awareness, lack of empathy, or lack of tools and templates. What do you think, panelists? Any surprises here?
I'm definitely not surprised by the lack of tools. I think we do a great job in LD of providing the tools. It's just how do you make them accessible and get people to use them? So
Yeah,
not
good one.
surprised on that one.
Number one with a bullet, lack of training.
Yeah, I would say also, I'm not surprised by sort of the, sorry, something just popped up on the middle one that I can't see the chat. There we go. Lack of self-awareness, because if you have that, it's very challenging, right, to get to somebody where they need to be, or to sort of get them to accept that there might be kind of growth and development opportunities there.
Love it. Love it. Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for those responses. You can keep them coming there to our audience. And we'll go one more. This is an open text response, which is, what are some examples of must-have management tools where you work? And the word tools is a little bit open-ended. So it could be a piece of technology, could be a methodology, could be a traditional tool, whatever it is that you interpret tools to mean. So you can put in as many as you'd like, and we'll see them, and those will be included as well in the follow-up materials. But just love to have people type in their open text responses to what are some examples of your favorite go-to must-have performance. I'm reading off the top there. Performance templates, good. One-on-one templates to help guide meetings, yeah. Emotional intelligence tools, love it. PI, not surprising. On a PI-sponsored webinar, we see some PI responses. Clarity on authority, KPIs. We got a little bit of alphabet soup with our OKRs and our KPIs and our LMSs. I love it. I love it. Servant leadership style. ChatGPT. Oh my gosh, we wouldn't have seen that months and months ago, huh? 360s. Dig it. I see in the chat as well, values in action, VIA from Seligman. Love it. Leadership involvement. SOPs, more alphabet soup. I like it. And PI, of course. Trusting environment. Ooh, nice. Mentors. All right. Books. Keep on learning. Yeah, books. I like books. And then I'll do one more here. The executive team living up to core values. Awesome. Good stuff. Good stuff. Keep them coming to our audience members. Love to see it. I'm going to go ahead and ask to go ahead and move on to the next bit here. When we start looking at all of our different perspectives topics, we like to highlight talent optimization. It's a discipline that tells us that in order to go from business strategy to business results, we got to get the people part right. And today we're going to be talking about new tools for the management trade, and managers really are the chief domain of Inspire in terms of inspiring people to perform at their best and to really have highest levels of engagement and well-being at work. So that privileged relationship either between peers or between a manager and their direct report, these are the types of things we're talking about. So that gives you a little orientation. We're going heavily into the talent optimization discipline of Inspire today. On the next slide, I want to show you that a lot of the inspiration for today's new tools came from a report that came out recently. You can see it on the screen, 5 critical actions to enable your people leaders to succeed. And with one more click, I want to show you something that I thought was interesting. Is a statistic saying that only 1/3, or I should say 1/3 of organizations lack a formal way to measure the success of their people leaders. So that got my favorite emoji, the no mouth kind of emoji there. And it's challenging, obviously, when we don't know what good looks like. And I think that that's a big percentage when you think about it. And a lot of times too, when even though we may have a formal way to measure the success, do our people managers really understand that? So those are the types of insights, and there's certainly a lot of discussion in there in that report. So I wanted to just put that up as opposed to our normal headlines. But with that, we're going to go ahead and dive into our panel discussion today. And panelists, we're going to be talking a lot today all about successful people leadership. And I'll use my quotation fingers there for people playing along at home. And I want to get us started with this one, which is, it's a seemingly simple question though. What the heck is people leadership? And maybe if we can get us started with this one, Rick, why don't you get us led off today?
Yeah, it's definitely one you hear a lot of definitions on. To me, it's really about, it's a mindset that you have where you value enhancing the work of others more than your own direct work. So many times you see new managers get promoted because they're the best salesperson, and they continue to be the best salesperson, but they're not making other people better. So you really have to change what you value. You're no longer valuing your individual work as an individual contributor. You're putting more value on making other people better so they can do more, so they can be more, or they can become more. And that's really what people leadership's all about, is you are working through people more than you're relying on your own resources and your own skills and abilities as an individual contributor.
Love that definition. Kat, why don't you give us your version?
Sure, yeah. So for me, it's about empowering and inspiring people to drive towards a common goal. So it's not just directing, which I think sometimes, people can sort of make it about that, but intentionally building that culture of trust. If everything starts from that trust piece, a lot of things can happen. If something goes awry, we can make it better because we already have that trusting relationship. And it's sort of thinking about the what and the how. So, if we forget the how we are going about things, that kind of takes, in my mind, the leadership out of it. We have to remember the empathy and the way that we're going about connecting and things like that are so important when it comes to overall people leadership.
Definitely hearing how the Menti poll results talking about training and self-awareness and empathy showing up in each of your responses as well. And Beth, I'll ask you to round us out here. What's your definition when I say something like people leadership?
It's really interesting because what Kat was saying about the what versus the how, if you think about a lot of what happens, and kind of to build on what Rick said, right? A lot of what ends up happening is people as leaders start to manage people instead of managing a process and leading people. And so we, as we sit back and think about our core values and our guiding principles, we've kind of highlighted this one, and it's entitled Leadership at Every Level. And so in our world, leadership is about a passion. It's not necessarily a position, but it does not require this simple hierarchy or structure. And in our world, we use the words of caring versus caretaking, right? So it's about caring enough for the person and creating this psychological or this space for psychological safety. But that doesn't mean not holding people accountable, but doing it with empathy. And that when we talk about how do we train and how do we lead, that's the art and science of leadership.
It's a great definition. And it's so true. I feel like so many times I talk to managers that are like, well, if I'm doing all the things that I'm hearing about demonstrating kindness and empathy, like how's the work actually going to get done? And today I think the irony in that is when we don't provide those things for the individuals on our teams, then the work's not going to get done because in some cases they won't be around to do the work because they're going to move on to somebody who will give them the things that they need. So I love that we've kind of set the foundation here. When we talk about people leadership, I'm hearing so many great themes around the selflessness and the level of empathy and the awareness and trust and all these great things. And Beth, I'll keep you in the spotlight, figuratively speaking, which is that leadership itself. And you mentioned it's such a big topic, right? And ultimately the practice of leadership varies a lot depending on the organization size, maybe the state of maturity. You're part of a very large organization where you have 6 nameplates and 6,000 employees, et cetera. So how do you end up clarifying for your leaders what the expectations are and how do they know their current standing at any given moment?
So if I could boil it down to one C word, it's communication, right? If you don't communicate expectations, then there's lots of different ways to communicate. We are actually in the process at our organization of creating what we call a playbook, right? So Rick, to your point about somebody who was a technical expert that made the transition into leadership, we put them into a training and our expectation is go forth and prosper. But how do we keep it front of mind so that the leader understands our expectations? We're creating kind of this digital playbook for our leaders. We discuss it through competencies. So this is a part of every single conversation that our leaders have with their leaders. We assess, we have goals, we document, but most importantly, if you think about how does a leader learn, how do we all learn? It's by actually reflecting what the other leaders are doing within the organization. So I'm going to take it as an example of how my leader leads, and that's how I'm going to learn how to lead, right? You can have playbooks, you can have all these types of things, and those are great. But really, the representation of how the other leaders act is how your leaders are going to learn. And so we want to make sure that we are at all levels exemplifying our expectations of what we want a leader to really be and do within the organization.
I love that example. There's so much scaffolding that goes into it to create that type of clarity, right? So important. And Kat, I'll ask you to pick up on that. So we're talking about leadership, clarity, expectations. How do we provide that? What do you think?
Yeah. So for us, we did spend some time as sort of a top leadership level in the company. We got in a room, we kind of hashed out what are our leadership capability expectations, and we came up with 5 of them. So communicates for understanding, coaches effectively, drives results, owns it, and leads with humanity. And the last one might be my favorite because that is sort of about that. For me, that is that caring, like Beth, you mentioned, not caretaking necessarily, but caring. And so we try to get those leadership capabilities infused and sort of institutionalized throughout the organization. And then in terms of accountability, we do build our leadership capabilities into performance reviews. We do try to have ongoing conversations about it. I will say it's not easy, right? And it's just, transparently, it's not perfect, but it's a work in progress. But I think it starts with the clarity. Like, you have to have, what is it that we're trying to hold people accountable to? And then you have to work toward the rest of it. So we're a work in progress there.
And in your example, I really love the balance between some of the more technical aspects about like own it and the drive for execution, et cetera, but also the humanity at the end. So it's very balanced in that way of a holistic approach to the leadership mantle, which is nice. And where Rick and I came from, we used to talk about mission accomplishment and troop welfare. In that order, of course, where we, in the old days. But I think that type of balance is very much appreciated. And with that, Rick, I'll ask you. So again, leadership expectations, how are you clarifying these, communicating them, and letting leaders know where they stand at any given time?
Yeah, obviously do things very similar as well, right? You got to have the leadership competencies and you got to communicate them. What is expected of you? I think the really important thing is clarifying that it's going to build at each level, right? If one of your competencies is business acumen, the business acumen of a frontline manager and a chief financial officer couldn't be more different. It's the same competency, but showing that there's a differentiation between levels is so critical. And that helps you do the time application and the values, right? If I'm in a CFO seat and I'm focused on what happened last week or next week, I'm not looking out at 6 months, a year, 2 years. So it's kind of clarifying, hey, your job as you get up to the senior levels of leadership is developing those younger leaders, going down to your frontline managers, figuring out who's the next manager. So you can kind of put some more specificity behind it, I guess, when you're saying, hey, these are your competencies, but there's a certain way you administer them, and it's going to graduate at each level. Just because you were successful at one level, it has nothing to do with the level you get promoted into. When you get promoted into the new level, you have new values, you have to apply your time differently, you have to learn new skill sets within the same competencies. So it's a continual conversation, I guess, is really the best way to sum it up. Like we talked about, it's every month we're talking about how you're developing. And then we're looking at it on a yearly basis and saying, are you growing up the leadership pipeline? Where are you headed? So you just have to provide very clear, very specific expectations, and you have to have the constant conversation, because depending on where the employee's at and depending on what their skill set is, they're going to have a different focus. So definitely want to harp on the communication. That is absolutely critical.
So powerful. And it's so important to be able to do that, because a lot of times when somebody gets passed over for promotion or they didn't get the role they thought, if you haven't had the conversation before about, well, at that next level, we're supposed to be looking a year out, and you keep talking about shipping and doing great quality work for this month, which is fabulous, but you haven't graduated to that next level, which is what is the expectation for that leader. If that's something that only happens at the moment of the promotion decision that didn't go their way, they're going to feel slighted by that. That's not a very human thing to do, right? Which is exactly picking up on Kat's point in that regard of making sure there's clarity and constant communication. I love that. This panel's all over it. Holy cow. I tell you this, though, a lot of times, one thing we're talking about is leadership in terms of providing that clarity. But I know from personal experience that leaders and effective leaders at that aren't born this way necessarily. So we have to develop them. And I think that's why I go back to the Menti poll, where the #1 response from the last time I looked at it was lack of training. And so when we talk about leadership development specifically, it's one of the most privileged types of training there is. And Rick, I'll ask you to get us started a little bit, which is how do you and your organization approach this topic of leadership development?
Yeah, I think you have to look at it more decentralized than centralized. The lack of training was the #1 resource. Yet, if we ask those people, they probably have a new manager training course. They probably have something that they provide on day one. It's not so much the lack of initial training, it's that constant conversation. And when I say decentralized LD, I'm talking about, hey, how is the centralized LD team? Can we provide resources so you can facilitate a session? We can build an e-learning course, your employees can watch it, but this follow-up discussion is where the learning happens. They're not going to absorb it through this micro-learning. They're going to get the concept, but you, through that facilitation, can help them apply it to their role. So we really try to focus on how do we equip our senior leaders with the resources to be able to go out and do the leadership development themselves. They know their people the best. They evaluate them every month. So they're going to be the people that can do that development. but they need the resources. So we try and focus on providing the resources so that our senior leaders can do their job, which is train, coach, develop new managers and elevate everyone up underneath them.
I love that. It's almost like if you only use the centralized resources and an internal site or YouTube or anything else, you're basically outsourcing a huge part of your job as to develop future leaders, right? So, so cool. Kat, why don't you tell us a little bit more about how you approach leadership development?
Yeah, so we are a privately owned company in Indiana that was started in 1985 and super successful over time, but not a lot of investment into leader development. And it was sort of this aha moment of like, what got us here is not going to get us there. We have got to, spend some time, energy, money, all the things on leader development. So we went out, and I'm a believer, I have a fairly small department. We don't have internal L&D necessarily. So I am a believer in the right partner as well around these types of things. This is not like, let me grab a deck off the internet and teach someone leader development, right? I believe strongly that that's not how this works, and it's certainly not the optimal way to approach. So we found a fantastic partner who I believe, is sort of revolutionizes the way that leadership development happens and works. I've been through in my career a lot of different partners. And so I believe in finding the right partner, and then also giving the time, the tools, the practice, because it takes practice, really intentional practice. It is an investment. It's investment from the company. It's also investment from the participants who are involved, right? Like, do you have the skill and the will to do this? And so all of those factors, I think, go into how we do develop our leaders. We also have, for our open positions, of all of our open positions, about 30% of those are filled through our internal talent. So I feel like we're trending in a good way as we're developing not just our leaders, but just developing people overall, to have that kind of internal promotion rate. So I'm pretty proud of that.
Nice. I love to hear that. And I think it's so true that, when it comes to the leadership development, there's a lot of different ways to do it, depending on your system, your needs, your setup, your investment capabilities, et cetera. But not doing it is the only bad option from what I'm hearing. So Beth, I'll ask you the same thing. So leadership development, you got a larger organization. How do you do it?
Yeah, so it's really interesting when the question goes out around leadership development, and the first response is, well, we need more training. And so most people assume that means in classroom, virtual, micro learning, things like that. And that's a part of it, right? But we really follow the 70-20-10 model. And really, if you think about it, how people think about how they should develop and train is usually they think about that 10% of in the classroom, but really it should be developed on the job and practical application. We have a conversation where we say, how do we create a space for people to fail safely, right? They allow the leader to support and drive certain challenges so that they understand what it's like, Rick, to your point, to be at the next level. But don't let them fail in an environment where it is going to be so punitive, both to themselves and the organization. And so we sit back and we have very deliberate and intentional conversations around talent management about what opportunities do we want to provide to this highly mobile, highly proficient talent that we have. So let's give them those experience. Let's have them run a project. Let's have them work across the family of companies. So they've been very used to, maybe they've been in Dent Wizard all of their, career. How do we give them exposure to other organizations that we have under the family of companies? But it's more about the practical application, about taking the competency or the learning and actually putting into action what they're doing. And then on top of it, not just allowing that person to, go out and test what they're doing, but feedback along the way. How are they doing? What are the places where they're succeeding? And we as a team owe them to provide them feedback on where perhaps they could strengthen other areas or where there's areas of opportunity to help drive different conversations at different levels. So 70% represents on the job, 20% is coaching and mentoring, and then 10% is really that in classroom. But a lot of people assume the magic fairy dust of training is going to solve the world's problems. And really, we need to be spending a lot more time on creating those really good opportunities where we create spaces for our leaders to fail in a safe way, and then they learn and apply.
That's where that practice comes in. I think,
Yes,
right?
Huge.
absolutely.
And there's just no other way to do it. I think a lot of times it's like, well, I want to learn Excel. Okay, that's a little different than learning leadership.
Right.
It reminds me of a time when I was trying to improve my swimming technique. So I got a bunch of videos and books, and I'm like, okay, I got this. Jumped in the water, and holy cow, everything has changed.
Absolutely.
You gotta have, coaching. You gotta have experience doing it. And I love that, creating safety to give people an opportunity. One of the biggest things I find in leadership is, how do you find your own authentic approach that still lines up within the rubrics that you're providing, the non-negotiables. Everyone's going to be a slightly differently based on their personality, their experience, their wiring. So you can only fail your way to becoming that type of an effective leader, which is really, really nice that you're creating safety for that to happen. I think when we talk about leadership development, a lot of times the endorsement or the key player in all this is the CEO or the owner or the president or whatever in the attendees to the webinar, your respective senior most person, for example. They're make or break for a lot of the things we're talking about today. So I guess I'd ask us this one, and Kat, maybe I'll ask you to get us started. When you think about the CEO or the owner role, for example, what do you want them to do or think about when it comes to supporting you and your mission for the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, so I feel like I am very lucky. I have a great partner. Stan Chin is our CEO. It's not a convincing situation. He is very committed to leadership and culture. He's a second generation leader for our company. And he sees the value and champions the efforts that we have going on. I have I think what is a kind of a fun story. We had a Leadership Academy development sessions kick off in January, and he came live to those sessions, spoke to the folks who we had selected to be in this group, and sort of a la the Zappos story, where Zappos offered folks $1,000 on their first day of employment just to leave. Hey, if this isn't the right fit for you, go ahead and head out, and it's fine. No love lost kind of thing. Stan stood up in front of the group and said, listen, I'm willing to offer each of you $2,000 if you want out of this leadership development program. We want to know that you really want to be here, and that, if you're willing to invest in yourself, we are willing to invest in you. But it was just such a moment, I feel like, because they were like, wow, like, he is here, he is invested, he is sharing his leadership philosophy with us, and he is basically telling us that we are an important part of this company and we are sort of the next layer. And so for me, it just hasn't necessarily been a hard thing. It is a little bit harder when you're determining either what tools to use or partners to use, right? Because then you're talking about, like, here's the investment differences, here's the philosophical differences, those types of things. So we certainly have those conversations, but the overall, like, we need to invest in this has not been an issue. It's been very, very supportive.
It's a massive boost in being able to have that. I think when you get into the specific tools or techniques or methodologies, sometimes I see experienced executives are like, well, this book was great. I got it when I was in my MBA program. You're like, that was 30 years ago. You realize
things have changed.
Things have changed. Yeah, we have that a little bit too. But Rick, I'll ask you to get us the next answer on this one. So how do you think about the CEO, the owner, the most seasoned executive, however you think about that? What do you need from them to help support you in your mission?
Yeah, I look at it as a two-way relationship. They need to trust that we're going to administer their vision, and we need to trust that their vision is the right vision for the company, and it's going to take the company where it needs to go. So when I think about that, that's really the role of the CEO. We're very fortunate. Our CEO is our founder still. So he was leader number one. He set that tone very early. He set that vision very early. And then we were able to apply his leadership mindset. And like Kat said, we very fortunate because he is fully invested in leadership development. We had a all hands session in Nashville about this time last year, where we brought in 400 leaders from across the country to just have a full week of leadership development. Fantastic event. And he was the one that did the keynote. He was the one that set the tone for the event. And it's really, we are more so just parroting his message. And that makes it so much easier when people can see that type of leadership, and we're just administering it. So we're very fortunate to have the CEO that supports us in that manner, and they are the model of leadership for the organization.
Yeah, so far we've got two examples of highly visible senior leaders setting the tone of like mind. Let's see if we're 3 for 3 on this one. Beth, what do you think? CEO, owner, what do you need?
Yeah, it's going to be a trend. We're going to go 3 for 3 on
Okay,
this
let's do
one.
it.
You know, and I think that says a lot. Like if you think about it, right, we've got 100% of the panelists, albeit 3 people, that have kind of shouted from the rooftop the importance that the owner, the CEO, the executive leadership team really not only exemplify, but support and drive and create the strategy and vision around kind of not just leadership, but we have a goal. It's around creating a world-class team. And for us, right, our product and our service is our technicians. And so we need to make sure it's not just the outcome for the customer, but that internally we have a really strong team that feels this trust. And our CEO knows our technicians' names. He came up through the ranks of being with the organization. So he was at some point a technician. So he understands the world in which they live and he can speak their language, which is really important. And so when they see him do, they go, oh, I trust him, right? He's been in our shoes before. And so therefore, what he exemplifies is how they mirror and do the work that they do. So I mean, in my opinion, having, and it doesn't have to be the CEO per se, but it has to be the executive leadership team championing for these types of activities, because as you think about how communication cascades down, the further diluted that communication is going to get. So you've got to get that person making sure that their direct reports are on, you know, on the same page and therefore kind of cascading all the way through the organization.
Yeah, and I think it's not a surprise that you represent 3 very successful companies, and the alignment that I'm hearing between the executives and the senior most people leaders, that's not a coincidence. And we're not going to go into it too much in this webinar. We have in others in the past about how do we work with executives and even managers who are not quite as switched on and aligned. And yeah, so there's a lot of great history that we have talking about that. But I do want to move us forward to this one, and let's go a little bit more tactical, if you will. And I'm going to move us on to the report that I had mentioned earlier. One of the findings I found very intriguing in the report was that there was this ambiguity that showed up between things like roles and goals. And I feel like coming out of the pandemic and into the teeth of economic contraction and a lot of different things happening, the average worker is not clear about what is my role relative to the other people's roles because everything has changed, or what are the goals, and things are moving so fast it's hard to keep up. So with this concept of ambiguity regarding roles and goals, I want to get our panelists' view on how to get it right. And Rick, I'm going to ask you to start us with this one.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing you have to clarify it by level. That is so huge when we're talking about leadership development. You're looking at the difference between the daily, the monthly, the quarterly, but everyone has a focus, right? The ambiguity comes when your boss comes to you and says, hey man, what's going on with this? And you're like, I'm looking at it right now on my screen, trying to figure it out. I'll have you an answer when I figure it out, but I'm in the process. And when everybody is focused on the same metric or the same KPI, that's when you start to get it. You feel like you're being micromanaged. And then, the response you get is, well, this is so important. We all need to focus on it. Well, I don't think we need this much brain power and salary focusing on this. Who's focusing on the other things? So I really think it's just about clarifying to people, because at the end of the day, the clash happens because everyone wants to help, right? If you have an aligned organization, you have a good culture, everyone's reaching toward the goal. They don't mean to step on toes. They don't mean to cause confusion. It just happens. So you kind of have to set that tone and say, hey, this is what your focus is. This is what your accountability is. And I think that really helps clarify, like, okay, my main priority is X. This is what I'm working on. I know my boss is working on this, and we mutually support each other so we can have those discussions, but we're not trying to do the same thing. We're not stepping on each other's toes.
Boy, it takes a lot of discipline though when you're the manager and you have somebody on your team and you know the answer, but if you tell them the answer, you've weakened them as a leader. If you let them find off on their own, then they're going to be a stronger leader because of it. And it's hard sometimes to let that just happen when in the heat of the moment. But I love that example. Beth, I'll ask you the same question. So again, the report's suggesting that there's this ambiguity around roles and goals. You have a big complex organization as well. How do you get it right?
So this is probably going to sound counter to a lot of the things that organizations strive for. But if you think about how an organization is set up, a lot of times we value speed over thoroughness. And sometimes, in my opinion, it's just taking a step back. It's having somebody kind of insert themselves and actually pause the team to say, listen, let's take a few extra minutes. Let's take a few extra hours. Let's take a few extra days, weeks. Let's get it right. Let's solve this problem as opposed to solving what is right in front of us. And then that just continues to permeate within the organization if only we're solving here. I don't think in our organization, as you said, but we have 6 companies. We're a growth company, which brings on a totally different set of problems and solutions to solve. But the great part is that if you are a leader in our organization, ambiguity comes as a part of what we look for. Somebody who can work in an environment where perhaps they have to be a little bit more agile, they kind of have to fill in the space. So we kind of screen for that as we enter into the organization. Because the reality in a growth organization is what I show you today on a piece of paper, it's going to look very different. And sometimes in our world, less than a month. And so the ability to transition and be agile is really important. Lots of tools that we provide, right? Cascade communication decks. We've got our performance process. We have our annual meetings where we document our goals and really everything is aligned as we think about the projects. They're actually physically aligned to those goals. We have our quarterly meetings, our monthly town halls, where we actually have our CEO stand up on a quarterly basis, give the financials of the organization. But it is important that we stress when we hire somebody that agility is really important. And so when you have that competence and you know that, the ability to feel a little bit less constrained in those moments is kind of feels like a weight off your shoulder. Like, oh, okay, I know that walking in, I know that's an expectation.
I really like that. It's almost like there's 2 types of ambiguity. One that shouldn't be there because we just haven't communicated
Right.
expectations. And the other kind is, no, it should be there because you can't predict the future. And if we tried to
Right.
pretend that we could be specific about it, we probably get it wrong. And that could be very wasteful too.
Absolutely.
Kat, I'm going to let you weigh in on this as well. So what do you think on this topic of ambiguity regarding roles and goals?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Beth that especially the more entrepreneurial a company is, the more ambiguity that, especially probably at the middle to higher management levels, like you have to be able to deal with. And then hopefully there can be more clarity as you kind of go down into the organization. I feel like just to add on to both what Beth and Rick said, I feel like one thing that we do in addition to those things is ask the people. So as part of our either pulse surveys or engagement surveys, we're like, do you have clarity on your role, right? Mm-hmm. And we can't drill down to individuals on those surveys, but we can look for trends in departments, operating companies under a certain manager, that kind of thing. So we have had a lot of conversations after those either pulse or annual engagement surveys where we just sit down and we're like, okay, there seems to be some maybe misunderstanding in terms of roles here, in this part of the organization. And that has helped, I feel like, because sometimes even managers just don't know. They think their people know what what the expectations are, and that there isn't a lot of ambiguity when in reality there is. So I think that's been helpful.
And they forget that they weren't on the conversation. I think that happens a lot of times. Our managers are in so many different conversations around so many different topics that they forget that their team members weren't in there. And so they forget to explain the why or what's going on. And so just kind of that jolt, like I say, of reminding them, hey, they weren't in the conversation. You got to walk through everything with them.
And it's counterintuitive to the point we were making earlier about when speed and agility is what we need. It seems counterintuitive to say, I'm going to take the time to tell you something I already know. Well, yeah, but if you don't, and you're not always going to be there, how are they going to make the best decisions if you don't take that time? So it's ironic that we need to slow down to go fast. That's a phrase I hear a lot. But I'm hearing you as leaders telling us that that's exactly what we need to do sometimes, which is huge. Another report finding I want to touch on real quickly is this growing impetus I talk about all the time, where we're starting to see well-being and topics like burnout and mental health challenges really start to show up in the workplace in a much bigger way than they used to. So I want to ask this question about, with this chronic burnout taking place, how do you encourage your people leaders, for example, to balance their own workload, their own wellness, and by extension, that of their people? And maybe Beth, I can ask you to get us started with a response on that.
Yeah, one of the greatest things I ever did was take vacation in PTO. And I say that because it was a real realization to the team that it's okay to do it. And so I stayed off and I was gone for 2 weeks. And I remember being at an MBA program, and they had asked me a similar question. And I said, I went somewhere for 2 weeks and I didn't answer emails. And they went, oh, like the whole room was like shocked, like, oh my gosh, how did you do that? And I was like, because I have really good people and I trust my people and I want them to see me taking the time off. I also am very vocal when I get up in the morning and take my children to school and I'm on a call. I'm like, guys, taking my kids to school, or I can't be on that call. I've got to go pick up my kids, or, hey, listen, I can't travel because my kid has a, music thing that I want to go to. We have to be vocal and we have to create this space where our people will emulate what we do. And so if I'm okay doing that, they're going to do it. And I was a little nervous. I got so many people compliment me after I was like, yeah, I took the time off. They're like, I felt okay doing it then when you did it. And I was like, oh, that's a realization that I need to be, really exemplifying what I want my team members to be doing.
Love that. Self-care is never selfish. Kat, when you've got humanity in your values and in your competencies, I got to get your take on this as well. What do you do to help your managers and by extension, workers balance workload and wellness?
Yeah, so I think going back to that trust piece, I think people need to be able to have that conversation. So there needs to be ongoing communication. Like if someone is struggling, if someone's out of balance, if someone is drowning, whatever that looks like, you're going to have a whole lot better chance of knowing that information if you have that trusting relationship in place and that sort of that ongoing communication. I also talk, particularly with my team and the manager team, a lot about everyone comes in this door, virtual door, real door, whatever that looks like, with like a suitcase of life, right? And everyone you just do not know all the things, right? And trying to think about that every single day and just remember, like, if something's off, there very well could be something going on. It could be that someone needs to take a break or needs to be off for a few days or whatever that looks like. We should be digging into those things and encouraging those breaks so that people can live their lives and have some personal time or be able to handle whatever that suitcase of life is bringing in at that particular time.
Yeah, and that suitcase changes over time too, right? People have some surprises with their family life, whatever it might be. So
yes.
I love that. And Rick, I want to pose this last question to you because I want to also move on to audience Q&A, but I got to get your take on this one. We talked earlier about the importance of our people leaders developing other people leaders. And I want to know specifically around coaching and skills development and feedback, for example, what if the managers themselves don't have experience providing that type of coaching and skills development? From your perspective, what can we do to help them?
Yeah. So going back to kind of the point that Kat made earlier about trust, I think that's where it all starts. If you're struggling to have a coaching conversation or give good feedback that your employees receive well, you should evaluate the relationship you have with them. I actually created a critical conversation guide for our organization. And step one on that is develop a relationship with your employee. If you don't have a relationship and they don't trust you, the feedback's not going to matter, right? If you're mowing your lawn and some random person walks by and says, hey, you're doing that wrong, you're like, cool, see you later, keep on walking. You don't care because they don't have the credibility. They don't know you. You don't trust them. They're not familiar. It doesn't matter. So it starts with that. The other thing is when you have that relationship, it becomes so much easier to ask about feedback preference. Hey, how do you prefer feedback? Do you want to be face-to-face across from each other at a desk? Do you want to go for a walk? Would you prefer I type it up and send it to you first so you have time to digest it? But you can have those open conversations because they trust you and they know the feedback is intended to get them better. So if you build the relationship and they understand the purpose of feedback, it just becomes so much easier to dial it in with their preference. But it takes experimentation. And you're building your bank. If you want to use the old cliche of the leadership bank, if you're building that leadership bank, it's okay if a feedback session doesn't go super well because they know you had good intent. You can revisit it the next day and you can work through it. When feedback goes sideways is when you don't have a relationship. The employee thinks you're trying to fire them. Hey, why'd I get on this pip? Because they're trying to fire me. No, I'm trying to make you better so that you can stay in the organization, earn more, progress more. So I would say it's all about building a relationship and you can just have a conversation. If you're familiar with the person, they trust you, it's so much easier to give critical feedback.
I love this last little bit of couple minutes we've been chatting about. And one thing I always like to say is if you want to lead human beings, you should start by being human. And that's exactly what I'm hearing come through. I mean, I love it. I love it. So I'm going to do this. I'm excited moving on to the Q&A portion of the show for our audience. You're going to want to use that Q&A button, as I mentioned before. Go ahead and get your questions in. I've seen some come in already, but there's time to get those in there as well. And at the same time, we're throwing a link into the chat. And this is to acknowledge that companies use talent optimization, the framework I talked about a little bit earlier, to drive better business results through better people practices. So if you're interested in learning more about PI's platform when it comes to talent optimization, or if you're a consultant or a partner, existing or new, whatever, we'd love to just follow up with you and see what you're interested in. So thanks for doing that. We're going to get the slides pulled up also because I want to show you and announce to our audience something very exciting, which is that we're continuing something I mentioned last month, which was a mastermind session. This is a group coaching session to continue the conversation. We have these types of talks that we do, and a lot of times people are like, yeah, but I want to talk about a very specific situation happening at the place where I work. There's not always time to do that. But in a group coaching session, we pulled together other like-minded people like yourself that are audience members, and I just facilitate a little dialogue. And the last one was so well attended and the feedback was so strong, we actually had 2 of them last month. So we're doing that again. So Rachel's going to launch a Zoom poll. So you can just let us know if you'd be interested in being considered for that. Depending on how many people volunteer, we may not be able to accommodate everybody, but if you're interested, there's a Zoom poll that's up on the screen right now. And if you say yes, then I will most likely follow up with you and give you an invite to join us to have a group coaching session. All right, let's go to the audience Q&A, my favorite part of the show. So I'm going to start with this one, which is for Kat. It says, what were the 5 items that Kat just reviewed on expectations? Communicate, drive results, lead with humanity, etc. Could you please recap those?
Sure. Yeah. So the first one is communicates for understanding, coaches effectively, drives results, owns it, and leads with humanity. And if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm happy to share those again on LinkedIn just to make it easier.
There you go.
We have definitions behind them too, so I can share a little bit of that information.
Holy cow, I'm going to be connecting with Kat on LinkedIn. No, we'll tell you how you can do that in just a little bit. How about this next one, which is, I would love to hear what sort of nuggets are in the playbook that Beth emphasized in the beginning. Is it more tactical, more emotional intelligence training, etc.? What kind of the key components of the playbook that you shared, Beth?
Yes. And so actually one of the tools that we use, we actually follow it if you haven't heard of it, it's called the DACOM process. And it's developing a curriculum. It's really meant to develop training where you get high performing incumbents in a room. Usually it's about 7 or 10 high performing incumbents in a room. And you actually like job band everything that they do. You literally we spent 2 days with our leaders where we just job band everything. And there's a very particular formula that you leverage to do it, but it's coming from their words. And then you ask questions and we design competencies based off of it. We design what we need to teach our new hires. If it was an external hire, we find out, hey, after 1 year to 2 years, which pieces were the things that you needed more information on from a continuous learning perspective. So there's pieces that are tactical, SOPs, things like that. But then there's also this kind of element of, if I were to look at my job on Monday morning, what would I do Monday 8 to 5? And we chunk it out and we have a timeline for them, but also how I might get it done. So it's not just the what, it's the how, and then what would I do in order to train either a new hire or what continuous learning would I need to provide our existing staff.
Very nice. Thank you, Beth. So I have another one here, which is on the topic of wellness. How do we navigate burned out employees versus the challenge of adding more people to the team or perhaps even subtracting people from the team when the same amount of work needs to get done? So basically, we already know that employees are overwhelmed. The executive appetite for change is really as strong as it ever has been. Managers are kind of caught in the middle. Everybody seems burned out. How do I ask them to do more when the team itself dynamic is changing? Any observations or thoughts from the panel on that?
If I could answer, I think a lot of times what ends up happening is we allow scope creep to overcome a lot of what we do. And so we have an expectation on ourselves of the work that needs to be done. And sometimes we forget to just ask the customer. And I call our internals are my customers, right? And sometimes I forget to ask them, like, what are your expectations on this project? Or like, what's your timeline? I've instituted my own timeline, but they may be thinking like a month from now. And I'm like, oh, I thought you needed it tomorrow. And so I think our desire as professional HR practitioners, and even lots of other roles within the organization, we we make a determination of what others need. And so we allow scope creep to come in. We forget to just ask the question, when do you need this by? And so then that helps us prioritize. The last thing I would just say is, as a leader and all of everyone on the call, it is incumbent upon us to support our team and just pause the conversation and say, okay, so let's talk about this. Let's really understand. Is it that we need to deprioritize other work? Is it that you're just maybe not understanding, and so it's taking you longer? Oh, sorry, dog. And I think it's open communication, but I do think a lot of times we set the wrong expectation about what the customer is actually looking for.
Yeah, makes total good sense. Go ahead,
I
Rick.
think there's another interest. You brought up scope creep. Something that I've seen happen is compliance creep, where you're given a compliance initiative and then a new one and then a new one, but you don't remove any of the old ones. And you start stacking it up, and compliance takes 30 hours of a leader's time. And it's like, how do we expect them to lead? So they spend 30 hours on compliance, 10 hours on operations, and they cut off the leadership because that's the easiest one to hide. There's no direct metric necessary. So I think you definitely have to be mindful of that if your team is feeling burnout. Going back to your point, Beth, on the priorities, right? What are the things we can take off? Hey, is this initiative really necessary anymore? This was 2 years old. Did we reevaluate it? Is it still valuable? Are we using this compliance for anything? So you definitely have to watch out for the compliance creep. I've seen that happen. And it can really just, it's the work that managers like the least. So it's really demoralizing. And in addition, that's just going to keep building on the burnout.
I'll add quickly too that a lot from the executive perspective, we often pride ourselves on having big ideas and innovative, creative ideas, but we don't necessarily understand the gravity when we just suggest something that people are going to take it and run with it because they want to do the right thing and they want to, they believe it's super important, even though we might just be we're human, we react instinctively. And it's one of my favorite things to do, but I don't want people to feel like you have to do everything. Another thing I love to do, but I don't think to do it often enough, is to say, well, show me the list and show me the cut line of what can be done and what's on the backlog. And then if you need to put something I just said on and something has to come up, I can help you make that decision. But I'm not going to just come up and do that. So I think the trusting relationship, the transparency, the clarity about goals, speak to me in my own language of saying, well, you know how we're trying to do this, because that's one of your biggest goals for us. Well, you want to add this thing, let me show you how this is going to come off. So I feel like that doesn't come as a game of trade-offs. It's a game of trade-offs. And I'm not as good at just bringing up trade-offs as I'm coming up with ideas. So it's like, let's partner. Let's partner as executives to make sure that when we say something, people might run with it and say, let's clarify, don't run with this. Or the other would be, let's understand we have to, if we're going to come up with idea after idea after idea, we also have to be getting good at the trade-off game. Yes. Nice. Okay. So I'm going to do this. We are coming up to the top. I like to make sure that I give people a couple minutes for the next sort of meeting that they have. We're going to go ahead and bring up the slides again, because I want to share, for example, where to go from here. So as a lot of our panelists have mentioned, LinkedIn is a great place to follow up with us. So in the follow-up materials, you're going to be seeing, and probably in the chat as well, links to follow us on LinkedIn, connect with us, ask questions that you didn't have a chance to ask. That would be great. But on the next slide, we also like to celebrate, for example, things that people are interested in celebrating. And so, for example, for Kat and Rick, definitely connect on LinkedIn. These are our panelists are willing to spend some time with you, learn about your situation a little bit. Please do that. And Beth as well. And Beth also has a charity that she wants to celebrate, which we love, which is near and dear to her heart, which is called the 24 in 24, presented by Clean Eats. And it's about kidney transplant charity. So thank you so much, Beth, for bringing that to our attention. And we'll have some information about that as well in the follow-up materials that you'll be receiving tomorrow. For myself, I don't have a takeaway for us or anything to celebrate because I've already mentioned the report. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it yet, you'll be getting your link to download that. So I hope you do that. And so that's what I have for you instead of a tip sheet for this month. And from the book giveaway perspective, I'd love to give away a copy of the book to a live attendee. And Sarah Wagner, you're the winner of the book. I'll be following up with you to find out where you'd like me to send you your signed copy. So thank you very much for that. Next month, we are going to be back here in the same, well, not the exact same place, probably, but Perspectives next month is going to be all about breaking free, which is how workplace rebels are challenging business as usual. It seems like almost everything has changed, almost everything, but a lot of our management techniques probably haven't. So that'll be next Wednesday, a month from now, Wednesday, July 17th at 2 o'clock Eastern time. So we certainly hope to see you there. And before we sign off, I definitely want to thank the Predictive Index, who is our sponsor, to all of our global PI consultants around the world who make talent optimization dreams come true for clients all over the planet. But an even bigger thank you for our panelists. You put on an amazing show today. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights, the real world examples. You're in here doing the work every day, the thoughtful work, the balanced work of driving your organization's growth, but also balancing that with the human side of it. I'm so impressed, and I can't thank you enough for that. So with everybody who's on the call, thank you so much for your time this month. As always, we hope to see you next month. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.